"You're 3 signatures short if you can't get them by noon. The farm is gone," that's what the federal agent told them after everything they'd sacrificed, after risking lives in a blizzard, after surviving war, after building a future from nothing. This was how it would end. What miracle could save this family now? Clara Morgan had 1 shot left, and just when all hope seemed lost, dust rose from the country road, engines rumbled in the distance, and one by one, the people came, not with banners, not with speeches, but with ink-stained hands and hearts that still remembered who he was. This is the story of a granddaughter's devotion, a veteran's quiet courage in a small town that refused to forget what honor really means. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The wind cut through the cracked cornstalks like a blade of ice across the vast stretch of 320 acres, once the pride of the Morgan family. There was only silence now. A century of life had grown from this land, but lately it had fallen quiet, buried under snowdrifts and shadows of fear. Clara Morgan stood on the porch of the aging farmhouse, arms wrapped tight over her scrubs and second-hand winter coat. She had just finished a grueling double shift at the county hospital, but hadn't gone to bed. Instead, she stood there watching the road, waiting for a letter she prayed wouldn't come from the side barn. Her grandfather, Henry Morgan, appeared, slow, stiff, breath white against the dawn air. At 79, Henry had survived war, droughts, and a heart attack that nearly killed him 2 winters ago. What he hadn't prepared for was this, the slow death of the land he loved. He tugged down his faded army cap and gave Clara a small nod. "Any news?" She didn't have to answer, her silence said enough. "No." "Mail today," she finally murmured. Henry stared at the icy path leading down to the mailbox, then at the tire tracks disappearing into the snow. "Well, no news doesn't mean good news anymore." Inside the house, everything felt cold. Even the warmth of the wood stove couldn't push back the dread. The living room was dim, decorated with memories, faded photos of soldiers in uniform, wedding portraits from the 50s, Polaroids of muddy boys holding fishing poles beside farm ponds long dried out. 4 generations had lived here. Now the bank wanted it back. Clara stirred a pot of lentil soup on the stove, her mind still at the hospital. She'd been taking every extra shift she could, but no paycheck could match the interest the bank added every month. After Henry's heart attack, they had to lease out the north fields. The tractor broke down, no harvest came. Then Grandma passed. "We should try the greenhouse plan again," she said quietly. "I've got notes, projections." Henry didn't even turn to look at her. "They won't care." "You think some banker in Des Moines gives a damn about homegrown mushrooms or heirloom lettuce?" Clara clenched her teeth. "Then we make them care." The snow began to fall heavier as night drew in. By midnight, the wind howled like wolves across the plains. The old farmhouse groaned in the storm, windows shuddering, fences rattling, and in that chaos, the phone rang. 3:17 a.m. Clara snatched the receiver. "Hello." A weak voice trembled on the other end. "See, Clara, it's Mildred. I think it's my heart." Mildred Walker, 86, was Henry's longtime neighbor and the closest thing to family besides Clara. Her home was half a mile east down a driveway now buried in snow. "No ambulance is going to make it in this," Henry said as Claire relayed the call. Clara's eyes met his. "Then we will." He was already putting on his parka. They loaded Mildred into the back of Henry's old Ford pickup. Only one headlight worked, the heater groaned, visibility was near zero, but Clara kept her hand on Mildred's wrist, checking her pulse while Henry gripped the wheel like a lifeline. "She's the one who found you when you collapsed," Clara whispered over the roar of wind. "This is the least we can do." "I'm not doing it out of debt," Henry replied through clenched teeth. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing." It took over an hour to reach the hospital. Once they had to stop and dig out the road with a shovel. Twice they nearly slid into ditches. When they arrived, Clara ran ahead to get help and the ER team rushed out to pull Mildred from the truck. Henry leaned against the tailgate, chest heaving. "You all right?" Claire asked. He nodded, but his hands trembled. They got home just before sunrise. The sky was still dark and snow still fell like powdered ash, but something was nailed to the front door. Clara tore the envelope free. Yellow paper, bold letters, no need to open it. She already knew what it was. Henry did anyway. Notice of foreclosure acceleration. Auction date, Wednesday, February 7th, 10 a.m. He folded it carefully and placed it in Clara's hands. She stared at it as if trying to rewrite its meaning by sheer will. In the kitchen, the soup sat untouched. The fire in the stove had gone out, and all Clara could hear was the wind wailing through the trees, like the past refusing to leave. What hidden strength will this family find to fight back? Keep watching on Graceful Valor Stories. The sun hadn't yet risen when Clara awoke to a soft knock at the front door. It wasn't loud, more like someone trying not to disturb, but in a house weighed down by silence and fear, even the faintest knock sounded like thunder. She pulled on her boots and robe, the floorboards creaking beneath her as she passed through the kitchen. The foreclosure notice still sat where she'd left it, on the edge of the table, half folded like it could fold its way out of existence. Another knock, 3 short raps. Then silence again. She opened the door slowly. There stood a woman in a gray wool coat dusted with snow. Her hair was swept up under a fur-lined hat, and her face, though mostly hidden by the collar, seemed familiar. She looked out of place on this forgotten stretch of Iowa farmland. Too refined, too composed. "Good morning," the woman said. "Are you Clara Morgan?" Clara blinked. "Yes, can I help you?" The woman smiled faintly. "I believe I should be asking you that." Before Clara could respond, Henry stepped in from the hallway, wrapping a scarf around his neck. His eyes narrowed. "I know that voice." The woman looked up. "Senator Mitchell?" Henry asked. Stunned, the stranger stepped forward and pulled off her gloves. "It's me, Henry." Clara's mouth fell open. You're the senator from Polk County?" "Yes." Elizabeth Mitchell nodded. "And more importantly, Mildred Walker is my aunt." Clara nearly dropped the foreclosure notice still clutched in her hand. "I received a call from the hospital this morning." Elizabeth continued. "They said a farmer and his granddaughter saved my aunt's life during a blizzard." She paused, glancing toward the snow-covered truck in the driveway. "I had to see who would do such a thing, especially on the same day their farm was scheduled to be auctioned." Henry rubbed his weathered face, unsure what to say. Elizabeth stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She looked around the living room, pausing on the black and white portraits on the mantel. "This house has character," she said softly. "So does the man who lives in it." Clara was still frozen near the door. "I don't understand. Why are you here? What can you even do?" Elizabeth turned toward them both now. "All business. I'll be honest, I don't make miracles, but I do read policy and I remember something, a clause buried in the Veterans Agricultural Support and Protection Act of 2018 passed with little fanfare. Hardly anyone uses it." She pulled out a small leather notebook. "It was designed to help combat veterans, especially decorated ones, hold on to their family farms in crisis, but most don't even know it exists." Henry raised an eyebrow. "So, you're saying there's a law that could stop this foreclosure?" "There's a chance," she said, "if your military service qualifies, and if the paperwork was mishandled by the bank, we can request an injunction, but we need to move fast, very fast." Clara finally found her voice. "And what happens if it works?" Elizabeth looked out the frosted window. "Then you don't lose this land, not today." They sat down at the kitchen table. Henry brought out a dusty binder labeled Army Records. Clara grabbed a box of her grandmother's old financial files. The senator called her aide, speaking in clipped tones about bank procedures, veteran relief policies, and Iowa foreclosure law. Time crawled outside. The sky turned pale with morning light. Then came another knock, this one firmer. Clara opened the door to find a man in a long coat holding a folder. "Name's James Leland. I'm the bank's representative," he said. "I was scheduled to finalize the notice and prep the auction paperwork today." Elizabeth stood. "Hello, Mr. Leland," she said, her voice calm, but unmistakably authoritative. "Senator Elizabeth Mitchell, Polk County. You may want to postpone that paperwork." The man blinked. I wasn't informed of your involvement." "I imagine not," Elizabeth replied, "but now you are, and if you proceed without reviewing Title 3, Subsection F of the VASPA Act, you may find yourself in violation of federal law." Leland stepped back. I'll call my office." "You do that," she said, handing him her card. "We'll be waiting." He walked away quickly, phone already to his ear. Henry exhaled slowly. "Well, I'll be damned." But Elizabeth wasn't finished. She turned back to Clara. "You said you had a greenhouse plan?" Clara nodded, surprised. "Yeah, it's rough, but I think it could work. We were hoping to grow mushrooms, micro greens, maybe some medicinal herbs." "Excellent," Elizabeth said. "I have a few friends in agricultural policy. Let's see what we can do." And just like that, the fire in the hearth wasn't the only thing burning again. The snow didn't stop even as the sun climbed above the bare trees. The wind kept dragging flurries across the fields, like nature couldn't decide whether to freeze the world or bury it. Inside the farmhouse, the mood had shifted. Yesterday's silence had cracked. Something like hope filtered through the walls. Now, Senator Elizabeth Mitchell sat at the kitchen table reviewing Henry's military documents, Clara nearby, flipping through receipts and financial records. Henry, meanwhile, stood at the sink, staring out at the white horizon, but beneath his calm face, something throbbed. His left leg, it had started hurting the moment he stepped out of the truck last night. There was a narrow stretch of road, maybe 30 yards long, where a drift had completely buried the path. No plow had reached it, and it had become impassable. Without a word, Henry had grabbed the old aluminum snow shovel from the truck bed and started clearing. The wind had cut through his coat, snow clinging to his boots, but he'd kept going. Each scoop was heavier than the last, and on one lunge, his boot caught on something under the snow. He fell sideways, landing hard on a hidden rock. A sharp pain tore through his calf, but he got up, gritted his teeth, and finished clearing the path, because Mildred was dying, and giving up was never part of his vocabulary. Now, in the morning light, his leg had swelled. Every step felt like a hot nail had been driven into his muscle, but he didn't say a word, not while Clara was still fighting for their home, not while the senator was calling in favors. "So, what exactly are the next steps?" Clara asked, her voice low but hopeful. Elizabeth looked up. We file a temporary stay through the state court using VASPA protections that gives us time to prepare a refinance package. If that fails, I'll bring this to the attention of the state agricultural board. They don't like foreclosing on war heroes, especially not in an election year. Henry chuckled. So, I'm a political asset now? Elizabeth gave him a warm look. No, you're a human being. You just finally found someone willing to remind others of that. Clara smiled for the first time in days, but just then, she noticed something. Henry wasn't putting weight on his left leg. Grandpa, he turned, yet she narrowed her eyes. You're limping. Henry waved her off, just stiff from the cold. She stood. Let me see it, I said. I'm fine, but she was already kneeling beside him, pulling up his jeans. Her breath caught, his calf was swollen, discolored, the skin angry with bruises and a long raw scrape running from knee to ankle. Why didn't you say anything? She demanded. Henry shrugged. Didn't seem like the time. Clara stood, furious and scared. You could have torn a tendon, you might have a clot forming, you were just in the hospital last year for your heart, and now this. I didn't want to be a burden, he said quietly. Elizabeth stood too, voice gentler now. Henry, you risked your life to save someone and then came home to fight for this land. That's not a burden, that's a man. They helped him into a chair. Clara fetched ice, wrapped it in a dish towel, and propped his leg on a pillow. Even then, he didn't wince. You've always been this stubborn? Elizabeth asked with a small smile. Only when it matters, Henry replied. As the hours passed, people began to arrive. First came a tall man in a VA cap, Mark Jensen, an agricultural consultant who'd once served in Afghanistan. He'd heard from Elizabeth and offered to assess the soil for specialty crops. Then came Dr. Pam Maya Hughes, a local veterinarian with ties to a USDA pilot program for sustainable farm conversions. By mid-afternoon, 3 more people had shown up, 2 university interns and a woman from the local farm bureau. Clara stood by the window watching a cluster of strangers walk the perimeter of the fields, take notes, and photograph the barns. It's surreal, she whispered, like the farm came back to life. Henry said nothing, he simply watched, a quiet fire rekindling in his eyes. Then the senator turned to Clara. I saw your resume, you were top of your class in nursing, but you also studied biology, didn't you? Clara blinked. Yeah, I thought I'd go into public health originally. Elizabeth nodded. What if this farm became more than just crops? What if it had a community wellness component, a medicinal herb garden, nutritional outreach, maybe even therapeutic programs for veterans? Clara's breath caught. That's exactly what I dreamed of, but I thought it was crazy. It's not crazy, Elizabeth said firmly, it's leadership. Henry looked at his granddaughter like he was seeing her for the first time. Later that evening, as the house filled with the scent of cornbread and warm stew, Clara stepped outside for a moment. The snow had stopped, stars hung in the sky like a quiet blessing, and down the drive in the distance, she saw the last glint of a car's headlights disappearing down the road. Tomorrow would be another battle, but tonight, they'd found their spark. Clara had never seen the kitchen so full. The table once used for quiet dinners and crossword puzzles was now buried beneath files, coffee mugs, blueprints, grant applications, and half-eaten sandwiches. The scent of roasted coffee and cornbread mingled with the sharp tang of highlighter ink and printer paper. Outside, frost clung to every window pane, but inside the room buzzed with energy. Elizabeth Mitchell had turned the farmhouse into a temporary command center. All right, she said, tapping her pen against a folder, we've got a 72-hour window to file the injunction and present an initial transition plan. That means by Friday morning, we need signed letters of support, draft layouts for land conversion, proof of veteran eligibility, and at least 2 preliminary revenue models. Mark Jensen was seated beside her, sketching out possible layouts for the southern fields if we go with modular greenhouses here and a compost system along the tree line. We can start growing within 4 weeks, depending on equipment. Dr. Maya Hughes leaned over the table, pointing at soil test results. The eastern plots got high acidity, but with mushroom cultivation, that actually works to your advantage. Clara, though exhausted, felt a strange fire inside her. She jotted down every word, noting timelines, fertilizer types, marketing partners. She wasn't just trying to save the farm anymore, she was helping rebirth it. Henry sat by the window, his injured leg propped up on a stool, a mug of coffee steaming beside him. He hadn't said much all morning, not because he didn't care, because he didn't want to get in the way. Clara noticed. Grandpa, what do you think? She asked gently. He took a long sip of coffee, watching the others shuffle papers like soldiers planning a battle. I think you're speaking a language I never learned, but if it saves this land, then I'm listening. Elizabeth smiled at him. You don't need to speak the language, Henry, you are the reason we're here. Just then, the front door opened. A gust of wind followed a man in a long gray coat, cheeks red from the cold. James Leland, the bank representative. He removed his gloves, glanced at the organized chaos, and frowned. I didn't realize you'd turned the place into a war room, he muttered. Elizabeth stood. Welcome back, Mr. Leland. He held up a stack of folders. Here's what you asked for: transaction history, loan timelines, Penalty clauses, foreclosure notices, and the original title documents. Elizabeth flipped through them silently, then she looked up. You've been accelerating foreclosure timelines under the minimum state window, she said evilly. 3 cases, including the Morgans. Leland didn't flinch. The bank has discretion, not when veterans are involved, she replied. You'll be receiving a formal inquiry by the end of the day. Clara's heart pounded. Leland looked at Henry. You're lucky to have her on your side. Henry nodded. I know. After Leland left, the room fell quiet for a moment. Clara felt the weight of everything pressing down again. They had allies, they had a plan, but there were still no guarantees. The land could still be lost. And then her phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from a private number. She played it on speaker. This is Colonel David Carrion, retired. I served with Henry Morgan in Phuoc, Vietnam. We called him Sierra Fox. Word reached me through the veteran grapevine. I'm calling to say if he needs anything, we stand ready. My son is a legal advisor with the Department of Agriculture. He'll be in touch. God bless. Henry leaned back, stunned. Clara couldn't speak. But Mark Jensen did. You're not just saving a farm anymore, Clara, he said, you're preserving history. By Thursday morning, the farmhouse no longer felt like a place under siege. It felt like a mission post. Blueprints were taped to the walls. A whiteboard sat propped near the fireplace with a crude project timeline scribbled in red and blue. The air smelled of fresh brewed coffee and pine cleaner. Outside, tire tracks crisscrossed the yard. What used to be empty snow now bore footprints, boot prints, and tire treads from volunteers and visitors. Something was changing, and yet, Henry Morgan sat on the porch, his crutch resting beside him, one leg propped up, staring at the tree line. A crow landed on the fence. He didn't move. Clara brought him a mug of tea, her face flushed from talking with a USDA program officer via Zoom. She sat beside him. You haven't said much this morning, she said gently. He exhaled. I still forward. I'm trying to see it. See what? The future, he replied. Your version of it. Clara looked down, then reached into her pocket. She pulled out a folded sheet, handwritten. It's the layout, my dream version. Greenhouses here, a small wellness hut here, chicken coops along the south slope. I know it's just lines on paper. Let me see. He interrupted. She unfolded it. He studied it for a long time. This ain't the same farm I knew, he said slowly. No, Clara admitted, but it's still the same land, and that mattered more than anything. That afternoon, a white SUV rolled up the gravel driveway. A tall man in uniform stepped out. Jason Carrion, son of Colonel David Carrion, his badge read Federal Agricultural Affairs Liaison. He shook Henry's hand with respect. Sir, I've heard stories about you since I was 10. Henry smirked. Hope your dad left out the embarrassing ones. Jason grinned. No such luck. Inside, Jason joined the team and reviewed the plans. He had a keen legal mind and a firm but respectful demeanor. What you've built in 3 days, he said, is better than what some programs take 3 months to finish, but you'll need to prove it's scalable. That means community buy-in. And Mark nodded. We're working on letters of intent from local food co-ops. Jason raised a hand. Not just customers, neighbors. And that's when the mood dipped because there was one neighbor who wasn't happy. Gerald Klein. He owned 80 acres adjacent to the Morgan southern fence, had been trying to buy Henry out for years. Rumor had it he had plans to sell to a development group for vacation rentals, and Gerald hated government types. That evening, as Clara walked out to check the compost test plot, she saw Gerald's truck idling at the edge of the fence line. He didn't wave, just stared. She stared back, and in that silence, she understood the future they were building would not be uncontested. Back inside, Henry had fallen asleep in his chair, the crumpled farm sketch still in his lap. Clara pulled a blanket over him. Elizabeth came in, arms full of printed contracts. She saw the sketch and paused. You know, she whispered, I think he's starting to believe. Clara nodded. I think we both are. Friday morning arrived under a pale sky. There was a stillness to the air, like the land itself was waiting. The house was quiet. Even the usual sound of volunteers chatting over coffee had been replaced with low murmurs and careful footsteps. They were running out of time. Clara had spent most of the night finalizing proposals, tweaking spreadsheets, adjusting forecasts. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice hoarse. Elizabeth was on her third pot of coffee. Jason Carrion was on the phone with a federal undersecretary, speaking in clipped, firm tones. And Henry, he was sitting in the barn, not by accident, not by fatigue, but because of something he hadn't touched in decades. His old field locker. It had been pushed to the back corner of the loft, hidden under a stack of burlap sacks and rusted tools. When Clara found it that morning, she helped him carry it down quietly, respectfully. Now it sat open beside him, dust rising from its lid. Inside were medals, photos, a battered map of Phui Province, and a folded letter yellowed with time. He unfolded it. Sergeant Henry Morgan, you carried me out of fire when I couldn't feel my legs. I never said thank you. I never forgot. Lieutenant James R. Holston. Henry read it twice, then a third time, and then he wept, not loudly, not like a child, but with the quiet surrender of a man who had held in too much for too long. Outside, Clara was reviewing logistics when she saw Gerald Klein walking toward the house. He didn't knock, he opened the door like he owned the place. We need to talk, he said bluntly. Elizabeth rose. Calm but alert, Mr. Klein. Gerald's gaze was sharp. I've been patient, I've watched you parade around with your politicians and your federal agents. But this land affects mine, that community farm you're proposing. It's going to change everything and not in a good way. Jason stepped forward. No one is forcing you to participate, but I'll be affected. Gerald interrupted. Traffic, water usage, noise, and don't pretend this isn't political. That senator and her friends will make this their banner. Clara stood up. We're trying to survive, you're trying to profit. Gerald ignored her. Henry knows what this land needs, or at least he used to. Ask him. He and I had an understanding for years. We keep things quiet, local, traditional. The barn door creaked open and Henry stepped in. Slowly with his crutch. I heard my name, he said. Everyone turned. Gerald straightened up. Tell them, Henry, you know this place doesn't need outsiders. Henry looked at the man for a long time, then he looked at Clara, then at the sketch still pinned to the kitchen wall. I used to think like you, Henry said softly, that holding on to the past was the same as preserving it, but it's not. He stepped closer, his voice rising just a bit. I carried men through jungle firefights. I saw what happens when people refuse to adapt. They die, or worse, others die because of them. Gerald's face twisted. So, you're siding with them? Henry looked at his granddaughter. I'm siding with her, he said. The room fell silent. Gerald didn't speak again. He left without a word. That afternoon, Clara received a call from KCRG, the local public radio station. We heard about the farm, about the senator's visit. Would you be open to an interview? She hesitated, then she said yes, because sometimes stories had to be told, and by sundown, the Morgan story was being broadcast across 3 counties. Henry sat on the porch listening to the radio with his hands folded. When Clara joined him, he whispered, I didn't think I'd live to see this. She smiled, rested her head on his shoulder. We're not done yet, she said. Saturday morning came not with thunder or fanfare, but with light, golden, gentle, slow-moving light. It crept across the snow-covered porch, spilled over the frost-lined window panes, and warmed the old wood of the farmhouse that had stood for over a century. Clara had barely slept. She sat at the kitchen table, papers fanned out before her like the wings of a bird preparing for flight. Jason Carrion and Elizabeth Mitchell had stayed the night. They were now sipping coffee in silence, nerves stretched tight like strings on a fiddle. At exactly 9 a.m., a black SUV arrived. A man in a federal jacket stepped out, briefcase in hand. Final audit, Jason said quietly. This is it. Henry, cane in hand, came down the stairs in his Sunday shirt. He looked calm, but his eyes gave away the storm within. You ready? Clara asked. He didn't answer, just gave her a look. At 9:20 a.m., they gathered around the dining table. The agent laid out the requirements like a surgeon detailing the final steps of a delicate operation. Preliminary approval is in, he said. All we're missing is one final component, community commitment. Clara blinked. But we have letters from the food co-op and the extension office. Those are institutional. What's missing? He said, tapping the form, is signatures, real people, local residents. Neighbors willing to formally engage with this farm, buyers, volunteers, supporters. We need 20 by noon. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. That was never mentioned as a condition. The agent shrugged. It's not a rejection, but it's policy. Clara's stomach dropped. We have 4. Henry said nothing. He simply stood and walked to the window, out beyond the field. The driveway remained empty. Jason rubbed his temples. We won't hit 20, not in 2 hours, not with how Gerald Klein's been talking around town. Clara stepped out to the porch. Cold bit at her cheeks. She stared at the road. It stretched straight through the Iowa countryside like a lifeline slowly fading, and then in the distance, a rumble. She squinted. Dust, tires, and headlights. 1 truck, then another, then 3, then 10, then, by 10:15 a.m., the yard was full. Pickup trucks, SUVs, minivans with rusted doors, and bales of hay in the back. People climbed out holding clipboards, folders, even brown paper bags of muffins and fresh eggs. Abigail Wolfe, the librarian, marched up the porch first. I want in, she said. You're saving more than a farm, you're saving our backbone. Behind her came Mr. Langley from the feed store, then the Morales family from the next town over, then Tom Weaver, a retired teacher who once taught Clara in 5th grade. Each one came with a signature, each one came with a reason. I lost my father in Nam. If this man saved lives there, he deserves this land. I got laid off last year. This farm gives us hope again. My grandson's in a wheelchair. Clara brought him eggs every Sunday without fail. Inside, the federal agent's jaw slackened as he flipped through form after form. By 11:47 a.m., they had 47 signatures. He looked up. Well then, he said, you've got yourself a farm. Clara didn't cry until she looked at Henry, who stood with both hands on his cane, lip trembling, eyes full of something ancient and raw. Gratitude. 3 hours later, after most had gone, Clara returned to the field behind the barn. The wind had died down. The snow was melting in patches, revealing soil that had not been touched in years. She knelt, pressed her hand into the earth. 1 month later, the sign went up, painted by hand, screwed gently into the cedar post at the front gate. It read Morgan Legacy Farm, for healing, for community, for honor. There was no ceremony, just Clara standing beside Henry as they looked out over rows of greenhouses, compost bins, and the first shoots of kale breaking through the thawed ground. The community had returned, so had the land, and so it's something else. Belief in our darkest moments. Kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.